Tonight's webinar is titled SuperVee to AeroVee, Engine History. And our presenter is John Monnett. John is the president of Sonex Aircraft. He holds a private pilot certificate with land and sea and glider ratings. He also holds an A&P, Airframe and Power Plant Mechanic certificate. John is a aircraft designer that has numerous designs that he has made over the years for experimental amateur-built aircraft. John has been doing VW engine conversions for the last 40 years, and he's been pioneering very unique things and making these conversions better and better for all of us to take advantage. In 2001, John was inducted into the EAA Home Builders Hall of Fame. And in 2013, John received the Society of Experimental Test Pilots Spirit of Flight Award and also the EAA Freedom of Flight Award. John's also a member of the EAA. John, with that, we sure do appreciate you taking time from your busy schedule to volunteer to be with us tonight and give us some information about the history of the VW engine conversion and your involvement. I'm going to turn control of the presentation over to you.
Tonight we just wanted to talk about my experiences, not necessarily I don't want to editorialize about anybody else's experience about VW engines and their use. I have obviously a strong love for these types of engines and their role that they play in experimental amateur built aircraft. And we all have a lot of different ideas about doing things, and this is just purely about my ideas and the philosophy and where we went. So we're going to do a short history of this and my journey to this engine, which I'm obviously very proud of, the AeroVee 2000 or 2.1, which also stands for 2100 cc's. In retrospect, we have to look back at this whole thing and how it started, the VW engine kind of craze, which has been an important part of home building from the start and what we know as the EAA. So back in the 60s, it was pretty interesting going to the first flying that I ever went to in 1966 in Rockford and seeing a little airplane called Fifinella that was built by now a Sonex builder, Hugh Beckham. It was a little Taylor monoplane powered with a little 40 horsepower VW. It was one of the first VW conversions I ever saw. And also at that show, we in a tent was a guy named R.J. Huggins, who was a real pioneer in bringing a VW aircraft engine or conversion business to the United States. So we saw airplanes being flown in Europe, like Jodels and Turbulence, little wood airplanes from France that were very nice. They were being powered by engines taken out of those little things called that look like Jeeps that we see in all the war pictures. And the countryside in France was littered with a lot of those wrecks, and people took the engines, a little 36 horsepower, some of them were 26 horsepower, and converted them to light aircraft. Well, Huggins had a really a knack for wanting to bring this kind of power plant to the United States, and of course we didn't see VWs coming into the United States until the mid-60s. So the engines weren't really plentiful, but these early ones, eventually found their way. And this is a perfect example of how simple a conversion would be. Some of you are familiar with airplanes like the Volkswagen. This would be the kind of conversion that was used then. We're going to show you a Vertex Magneto, which is straight out of the hot rod industry, so it is different than the Magnetos that we have in cars. It's fit in a distributor. It uses a top-driven downflow or carburetor, which was standard. And right here we have where a prop hub would be. This was really the pulley that drove generator housing, etc. So this was a very rudimentary and simple, inexpensive conversion for the time. Huggins built a little manual that I still refer to occasionally, just for fun, and on how to make prop hubs and that kind of thing for these engines. Really an education, and if you look online, you probably can find it. He was very innovative in what he did with engines. These are this is a little 40 horsepower, it's 1200 cc VW engine, and he made a casting for the back, which I was always impressed with the kind of his thought process. Using a little gear, this would be normally the flywheel end of the engine, and it is where we would put a little unit on the back of this to have a gear to gear two slick magnetos. So it actually had dual ignition, and the heads were bored for extra spark plugs. So you can see the aircraft style spark plugs up on the top here. The interesting thing is this is a long manifold going to a downdraft Sonex carburetor. So the intake came up, down through the carburetor and into the heads. Pretty long run. You actually had a little heat muff on this engine. Again, this is only about 40 horsepower, so it had to be for a real lightweight airplane. And a lot of these conversions were done. Well, I shouldn't say a lot, but in those days, you know, it was a pioneering effect. This is probably the most creative thing that Huggins did. It was so far ahead of its time, and it really was a watermark in what could be done with the components of a VW engine. And what he really did is developed a whole casting for a crankcase that actually turned the engine upside down. Because the VW has intakes on the top of the heads, this put the head intake at the bottom, so it's more conventional to an aircraft engine, and was a very clever thing. But it's, again, ahead of its time. It had dual ignition. You can see this, the oil pump. This would have been the front of the engine, so it turned in the conventional rotation anti-clockwise for the propeller. Used a little Zenith updraft carburetor. Very cool, but you know, that engine was, at the time, and you've got to look at what happened in 1968. In those days, you know, we had a different economy, and when we were breakout home builders at the time, so everything had to be reasonable. Obviously, this was all hand machines before CNC machines came on, so these castings and everything that related to this engine was very expensive to produce. But I have to salute him for at least inspiring the idea of what you wanted to do with an engine that's an automobile engine originally, and converted to aircraft use. Of course, the neat thing about a VW is it really had its roots in being designed as a boxer engine for aircraft. So how I got started? Well, this is pretty funny. Back when I was doing a Cub, and my first airplane was an Aranca, garage of a little house that we rented, and one of my friends who had bought my my Cub coupe, that was a '39 Cub coupe I restored, came in the shop, and I was working as then president of Chapter 153 in Elgin, Illinois, and trying to build a midget Mustang, and it was just too expensive for me to handle at the time. And he came in, hey, look at this article in Popular Mechanics. There's an airplane you can build for $400. It's called the Genie's Teeny. So we sent off for the plans. There's a Cal Parker design. Got the plans. They were like $15. I think they were worth about $2. So nothing would work or fit and whatever. And over the summer, as being a school teacher, I actually built this airplane, the Mini, which was a highly modified Genie's Teeny. So this is my favorite person. Betty's standing next to an airplane that I built in, this is the basic airframe for the Teeny. I built in about 2 months' time in the garage of our rented place. And once I stood back and looked at it, I see it has a junkyard engine on it. And of course, that was the way you obtained VWs at the time. I looked back and said, this just isn't right. Well, one, it has a nose gear. And two, I didn't really like the way it was designed. So we highly modified it. I got the drill out and drilled out and took the tail off of the airplane, rebuilt a whole new tail cone for it, used a truck spring and some of the components that I had from my Midget Mustang for the landing gear. Steve Whitman here is really famous for his spring steel gear and his tapered rod gear, and I kind of modified that by just going out and get a couple of truck springs and built this airplane. But the important thing was that the engine in here was a 40 horsepower aero conversion, not aero conversion, but a conversion that I used the drawings from Huggins to build the prop hub and the Magneto drive system, exhaust system, etc. For the airplane. And actually, it was a fun little airplane to fly. And this is 1970 at Oshkosh here, and in the background there's that tent. And there were only 2 tents like that. One was a display tent, and one was a meeting tent. And we had a great time being able to fly in the morning, and a couple of VW powered airplanes, myself and Bob Ladd with his Taylor monoplane would fly in the morning with the famous Ray Heggie and his Chipperosa. It was a great time of my life and a real first experience of getting involved in a fly-in. But the real game changer came for me really at Rockford, actually sitting underneath a tree with a few guys and Steve Whitman, talking about a new class of racing. Now, we had seen the Fifinella that I talked about earlier, and we saw an airplane called the Gold Bug that came in that if you want to really see an interesting airplane, Google that, the Gold Bug, and it was VW powered. And believe me, it was a remarkable piece of machinery, to say the least. But Steve was there talking about, we want to do racing. Continental racing's expensive. We want to come up with it. We want a class of racing where a guy could have a really nice sport airplane and race it on the weekends and enjoy it otherwise. It could be powered by a VW converted engine, 1600cc. So a formula was devised for this class of racing. And I really got excited in 1970 when I brought the Mini up to 1970 when I brought the Mini up to Oshkosh. I saw this airplane, the V-Wit, partially completed, and of course Betty and I looked at each other, and I went back to Elgin after the fly-in, and literally on the kitchen table, without a lie, we designed an airplane called the Sonnery 1. This airplane was built and completed in a 9-month period. It had, unlike Steve, it still had a truck spring for a landing gear. It had a 1600cc VW. The airplane weighed 450 pounds, met the Formula V racing category, and really was a benchmark for us to develop. And probably the thing that really got me involved in really wanting to convert VW engines is that this airplane, I built the airframe and bought an engine complete from a guy named Ted Barker out in California that was kind of an early guru of VWs. I contacted him, said I wanted to build a Formula V racer. Said, I'll build you a super engine on 1600 cc's with dual carbs, and it'll be great for racing. I'll have it pre-run and etc. and everything. Well, I received the engine, and here I am a little perplexed because we put it on, and actually the way the manifold was built, the carburetor, it couldn't not run like advertised. It didn't run. It had carburetors that were mounted on a different plane, and a manifold that was roughly welded, and it was really pathetic. Keep in mind that my total cost on my Sonnery 1, including that new engine, was $1,200, which was pretty amazing. So we went to work, and here it is tied down to a tree, trying to get this engine to run. It had some unusual manifolds. We straightened those out and got them kind of running. Went to a single carburetor and eventually got the airplane up to Oshkosh in 1971. And actually this airplane spent most of its time with its nose in the tent of the display area at Ted Barker's booth, saying, you know, you got to fix this, it doesn't work. Eventually this airplane became a test bed for my own conversion ideas. This airplane I was really proud of. It had several different tails, different wing configurations. It was the first airplane to fly with a dural landing gear, aluminum gear, which we were, again, used a lot in. We developed the first gear on a pit special. It was kind of fun because when we moved up here in Oshkosh, and of course we were friends with Steve through racing. Steve Whitman, even though he was famous for his steel gear and steel rod gear, his last airplane had aluminum gear on it that I made. And we continue to look at how we could streamline the cowling and make this airplane work. So one of my partners that actually was in the developing of the aluminum landing gear, Mike Core, was based in La Crosse, Wisconsin. A nice phone call from Mike one day. Said, "Hey, you know, I've got this gear, and also I have a father-in-law that's a pattern maker. Do you have any ideas for anything that we could cast? We have a foundry up here. We could do stuff." And I said, "Of course. I have an idea about a streamlined nose cone for the engine." And sure enough, Mike's father-in-law made the pattern work for this original SuperVee prop extension with a support bearing on it. It had some limitations as to horsepower that we could run through this prop hub, so 1600 cc was about the limit. But what this did was allowed us to streamline the front of the airplane as much as possible. Steve had a different view of VWs. He wanted to use metal props, so he made a large extension on the back of the engine using the transmission housing and a long casting that looked like a big flower pot that had a bearing on it, and that got him a streamlined front end. He did run into a tremendous amount of problems with harmonics and torsional vibration, and broke several crankshaft or drive shafts for that. It's a pretty interesting story. But one of the things we wanted to do was simplify the back end of the engine, and none of these VWs had at the time a shock mount like a Lycoming or Continental. So we developed this X casting, we called it. It was not machined, so it was simply bolt onto the transmission housing. We had a center flywheel drive with lugs on it, and it would drive through a coupling. Now, this little coupling back here is just like a washer with two 90-degree apart slots, and that allowed for a little misalignment in the crankshaft and driving the Magneto. Everybody uses that to date. Many of the VW converters still use that, but the thing that we found is that the original ones that we ran with the Ted Barker engine had a phenolic-based drive coupling, and it was associated with a Magneto that had an impulse coupling. So the impulse coupling hammering on this thing would break it up. I actually at one time took off of our little strip, a 1,600-foot strip called Stern Strip near DuPage County Airport. And the minute I got off the ground with the airplane, the engine went sour. It took me literally about 2 miles to make a 180-degree turn, come back and land on that airport. When I landed, eventually took the Magneto apart, and that coupling, the original phenolic coupling, was in 16 different pieces. So it was just the parts barely driving the Magneto at a very retarded state, and just enough power to fly. Luckily, the Sonery flies really nice at low speed, about 55 miles an hour. With this development, when we started looking at the engines, this was also the time in the late 70s when dune buggies and little short track racers, midget racers, were starting to go to VW power. So there was a tremendous amount of activity in producing after-the-market parts. So after-the-market parts mean bigger cylinders, pistons, some stroke cranks, anything to get more power out of this basic 1,600 cc engine, because the blocks were available. So there were all kinds of businesses that popped up, Claude's Buggies and number of other companies like that, MP, etc., that built parts. So we were able to increase the size of our engines, and we've always designed airplanes based on not only their wing loading, but their power loading. So this is a Sonnery 2 powered by originally a 1700cc engine, and that meant that all we had to do was put larger slip-in cylinders. We got a little more horsepower out of the engine. The airplane weighed about 500 pounds empty and would do a useful load for the kind of people that we were at the time, and that means skinny little guys compared to what we are today. So as we improved engines, we looked at not only what we had done with that SuperVee extension, and here's an example of how we refine the airplane. This is the original Sonnery 2 prototype. It has a SuperVee prop hub on it, so you see the cowl is quite streamlined away from the cheeks. This is an EV hub. This is a shorter hub, but we modified the cowling so that the actual loss in performance was almost unmeasurable, and made for a lot less expensive conversion because now we had just a simple prop hub to put on instead of an extension. So eventually that SuperVee extension was discontinued. One of the other big, I think, breakthroughs as far as we're concerned in flying these engines was carburation. And this is the first, I was the first one to fly with this carburetor. It's called a lake injector carburetor. Very simple little thing. Well, you can see that it's pretty light. It doesn't have carburetor heat. The actual design of this simple, it's a fuel delivery device, I guess we would call it. It's a guillotine slide that is opened by the throttle, and as it's opened, it either exposes and or pulls a needle out of an orifice. And that needle is tapered. It's usually only on one side, so that it has suction. And that delivers fuel and air in the right mix to the manifold of the engine. So very simple, and because it's a slide carburetor, it just doesn't ice because it's straight through venturi. It's not neck down, and there's never been any really historic record of these ever having ice. The fault of this carburetor was that this is the fuel line, and every time you move the throttle, the fuel line moved with it. And that was only a little 1/4-inch diameter tube that had a 90-degree fitting on it, and occasionally they would fatigue and break. And that meant that your fuel line was disconnected, and that was not a good situation because you didn't have an engine. So we looked at other carburetors, and along came the Pazzo Carburetor, designed by the same individual that did the lake injector carburetor, only this one was die-cast, fairly rough carburetor. We sold hundreds of these back in the 70s and 80s. Again, a simple solution. This one did not have a moving fuel line. It had a moving throttle. Now, the thing about this was that when we did a lot of cross-country flying for demonstrating races, etc., there was no controllable mixture control on this carb. And it's a straight-through carburetor. Understand that it doesn't have a float chamber to stop fuel flowing out. It needs to be adjusted so the needle is in the proper position relative to the slide that opens the carburetor. And once that's set up, it's great for sea level, and as you go to altitude, of course, it would start running rich. Well, our answer was simple. We just reached down and start closing the fuel valve on the tank. That would control the amount of fuel that was available to the orifice of the carburetor and the fuel flow, and it leaned out just fine. Everybody goes, that's absolutely crazy, but when you think about it, that's exactly what you do with a normal mixture control on any carburetor, is you cut down the fuel supply to the main orifice, and that leans the engine out. So at set throttle settings, that was just dandy for us, and not having all the carburetor heat box and all the extra stuff that goes on this engine was really important. Well, we had the engine conversion pretty well controlled. We had a slick Magneto, etc., running it, just a single ignition. And then came the need for radios. This radio right here is the impetus for all of the stuff that we've done in the past. So Regency standby. This little radio had one channel, a possibility of 10 channels, a tunable receiver, and in $1966, Betty and I spent our first tax return money for this radio. It was $1,000 back then. Now, my whole airplane cost $1,200. So it was a big deal, and it was just a walkie-talkie, but I could get in and out of DuPage County Airport with just one channel, and if I wanted to spend for the extra 10 crystals, then now, I had a $1,500 radio. But we made a modification to it, one of my friends, so we could put a headset radio on it, and ran it off a little gel cell, but that was just unacceptable, so we needed to fix it. Well, we looked at all kinds of things. Bicycle generators with a propeller on them. The ones that rub against the tire? We mounted them on a wing, played around with that. It just that didn't work. A friend of mine said, "Hey, you ought to go look at a Harley alternator. They've got a new thing in their motorcycles. It's really cool." It's an alternator that's in the transmission housing of the motorcycle. The drive shaft goes through it. It's direct drive. And it's really neat. And I saw some of the components. I went over to the Harley dealer and looked at it. I said, "Wow, this is perfect. This will probably work." And how much is this alternator? Well, it was $500, and that's like that isn't going to work. I don't know. So, and somebody mentioned, well, Briggs and Stratton is, they're doing their new lawn tractors and everything, and they have these alternators built into the flywheel. So I got on the phone and called Mr. Stratton. I called Briggs and Stratton and got a hold of the president of the company and said, I've got this airplane called Sonnery. And surprisingly, he said, "I know the airplane, and I'm an EAA member, and what are you doing?" I said, "Well, I got this VW conversion. I want to put an alternator on it, and you have a little alternator that will work." He said, "Well, John, that alternator is, it's really cool, but you don't want that flywheel, because our flywheel is cast iron. It has molded in magnets that spin around the stator, and it has to be machined. This is far too heavy." I said, "Oh, nuts." He said, "Well, I'll turn you on to the company that made that unit, and call them up and see what they have." Well, I called them, and it was a company called Synchro. It was in Indiana. Sure enough, they had a 10 amp alternator. It had a hole in the middle. Now, what was important about this whole discovery is that this magneto coupling in the upper right hand corner here is 3 inches in diameter. Well, their stator, this magnet ring, this is not, by the way, this is our modern stator, but it was something like this. Looked like a little radial engine with wires wrapped on it instead of cylinder fins. It had over a 3-inch hole in the middle of it, so I surmised that I could mount the stator on our casting and make a flywheel if we had to. And they said, "Yeah, we have a flywheel. It's got magnets in it. It's cast, and it needs a flywheel. It's just the unit that has the magnets in it. They're not magnets yet, so you'd have to zap them after you machine it." And I said, "Well, I can't do that." Well, could you do that? And they said, "Yeah, we have a magnet zapper, and we could machine these things and supply them to you, and you could make a flywheel." Well, we were in the aircraft spinner business, one of our subcontractors for making our prop spinners, so they could spin a flywheel that we could put the magnet ring into, and that would mount on the back. Well, that led to the design of this thing called the Electro-X. And the Electro-X was not only the magneto mount and the shock mount, but it also mounted the stator for the magnet flywheel to give us a 10 amp alternator system. And that was the major breakthrough. This is the first aircraft engine to ever have a stator alternator on it. One of the funny things is that eventually we were copied, literally. Happy Engines started producing stator alternators that looked just like ours, and we found out that they were using our tooling that we paid for at Synchro, and that soon came to a stop. But the point is that we developed this basic engine conversion back in the 80s, and we have to look at the time again. In 1980, computers didn't exist as personal computers. We didn't have CNC machining, etc. We had to do things the old-fashioned way. We developed not only dual-port intake systems. We wanted to have an intake system that didn't require any welding. It was very straightforward. Many of the engines had single-port heads. We developed a simple EV prop hub or prop hub extensions, an Electro-X casting with a single magneto driving through that, and even rocker box covers and some of the accessories. So this was a complete AeroVee conversion system, and to this day we still get calls. I have an early AeroVee engine, and oh really? Well, we didn't really produce very many engines ready to run. These were designed to bolt onto an existing engine. You had a basic core engine, which is your basic long block with heads and crankshaft, etc. in it. So we never knew really what size. This could go on a 1600 cc engine. It could go on a 2180 cc engine or whatever, but or a junkyard engine. So whenever there was a failure, it would be like, oh, it was an AeroVee engine. Well, it wasn't technically an AeroVee engine. It was a VW engine with some AeroVee parts on it. It's a basic cutaway, early configurations. This is a top-mounted oil cooler, which we see a lot of people using now, and we've actually improved on that. This is a typical example of a single-port head, and over here a dual-port head and a cutaway. It's back, when we were at the fly-in 1 year with a display engine. Burt Rutan had just flown his very easy in. And he had some engine problems. We were approached by Golda Cox, and all of you know who Jack and Golda Cox are, and Bert wants to buy that engine you have on display. It wasn't this engine, it was a complete engine, but he needed an engine to set a record, and at the time we didn't want to give him a brand new engine because he'd burn up several VWs with his installation. One of the things that I thought was great about Bert is he designed some very interesting airplanes, did not know how to install an engine in an airplane. So we were very cautious about it, but I had my little racer down in Elgin, Illinois at the time because I ran out of gas over the house, buzzing the house late. Tell Betty I was going to be late one night, and landed on a golf course and hit a no parking sign. So the airplane had a little bit of damage on it, but that engine was taken out. So some buddies of ours flew down to Elgin and took the engine out of the airplane and brought it back to Oshkosh. We installed it in a very easy overnight, and of course 2 days later Dick Rutan set a 17-hour record, endurance record with that engine, and I was very proud of that. It was the engine out of my racer. So we did produce some engines. 1850cc engine was a little different. It was bored out a little bit, bigger cylinders, and still a standard type crankshaft. So this gave us a little bit more power to be able to do some things with. But as this craze of racing was going on, we found people now making forged crankshafts or modifications of crankshafts to get more stroke. So the basic heart of our engine even today, and all of the people that are in the conversion business, whether it's us or anybody else that you see doing VW engines, the basic core of the engine is almost identical on all of them. So it's just the variations in the way that they're converted that make the differences. But when we got to this up to over 2 liters, 2180 cc's is a very popular size, we were able to do some things with it. This airplane was a standard conversion, and it didn't have an Electro-X on it or anything, but Pete Buck, my design partner, was and I just decided we wanted to build a hot rod. We were confined by the Formula V class airplane. We had to do a certain formula. Well, we said, what if we throw all that formula out the out the window and designed just a racer, and this is what we ended up with. This is a 405-pound airplane, had a 21cc engine, 2180cc engine in it, AeroVee, 11-to-1 compression ratio, no oil cooler, and was just basically a hot rod. This is not something that we wanted to turn loose on the general public as a home built, but you can see that it is the predecessor of what we do today in the Sonex aircraft. In 1982, Chuck Andrews flew this airplane during the Oshkosh 500 and it had adjusted airspeed of 213 miles an hour. That's a 500-mile race running at full throttle on an engine that's 11-to-1 compression ratio, no oil cooler, and never had a heating problem, but went like stink. And the next day, we were qualified for FAI, and with this VW-based engine, ran the 100 kilometers. You can see it 185 miles an hour, and the 500 kilometers. This is the days before we had GPS. This is dead reckoning aviation over a triangular course. Actually, we had to take off at 666 pounds. That's 300 kilos, which is the lightest class that you can set records in with airplanes. It was designed for ultralights, and the ultralight that had the record was 66 miles an hour the year before. So we had made a quantum leap, and I guess I forgot to mention that when Steve and I showed up with our Formula V racers in 1971, the previous year in 1970, the fastest VW-powered airplane ever was Bob Ladd's from Milwaukee, Wisconsin, an airplane called Chihuahua. It was a highly modified Taylor monoplane, retractable gear, bubble canopy, pressure cowl, 1500cc engine. Just a beautiful little airplane. It did 128 miles an hour. In 1971, Steve and I showed up doing 170 with a VW. So it's a big, big leap in the airplanes, and again, that made a difference. So as we got into larger engines like the 2180cc engine, this is a stroke crank, a bigger bore cylinders, and all kind of aftermarket parts for the racing industry. So it's not a big deal, but this is a straightforward EV engine, and remember, this one does not have electric start. It just has a magneto, and you'd have to prop it to start it. But for a light airplane, it really did the job, and it really proved the engine. And along with the Monnett racer, we knew that the core of this engine was what we were going to build our future on. And it was able, because of the increase in the power of the airplane, the engine, we were able to do things like stretch the sonoray. So now we could look at a different power loading because we were producing a lot more horsepower. We could build a little bit bigger airplane. This is stretched, so it had a bigger cockpit and a higher gross weight. And that was a predecessor for a lot of things. So it really was an end of an era. In 1986, Betty and I sold our business to an English company called Inav, and unfortunately within a few years they were out of business. So we were out of the business a little bit, and one of the unfortunate things that happened during that period of time is the foundry that had all of our pattern work for the aero conversion stuff of the early days, the AeroVee engines, burned down, and we lost all those patterns. So we're moving ahead to a new age, and when I talk about that, I mean that in what happened in 1980 was 1985, personal computers, CNC machines. So now we could do things a little differently. So the bridge between the Monnett and its capability and what we now know as a more modern Sonex line of aircraft is really important to look at. We were able to, when we developed the Sonex, we knew that it was going to be VW powered. We knew it was going to be 80 horsepower approximately. We could get the airplane flying with the little Jabiru 80 horsepower and eventually a Jabiru 3300, which is 120 horsepower, but we really knew that the VW was going to be the thing. So it gave us some breathing room with a airframe, a new airframe, to develop our conversion parts. And because of the miracle of CNC machine parts, laser cut parts now that we have that we've incorporated. This was really an important step, and the first part of this puzzle was the AeroCarb, because Pazzo Carburetor and lake injectors were no longer available. They had some drawbacks that it was hard to mount a throttle to them. It was hard to get them set up, and the needle adjustment was very coarse, because every time we wanted to adjust the needle, it had to be turned 360 degrees, which, if you have any threads at all, that meant that it was a fairly coarse adjustment. So I came up with some ideas for this carbon with a fellow EAer and great machinist. Dave Yuckham came up with this carburetor that did the kinds of things that we wanted to do. Why did it exist? Because we had a 3300 installation in our Sonex. This is a Jabiru 3300. You can see the AeroCarb in the bottom here. This engine originally had a Bing carburetor. It comes equipped with a Bing carburetor. A Bing carburetor is an interesting carburetor, probably better suited for motorcycles. It has a self-adjusting mixture control. Well, in our faster airplanes, the cowl pressures, the ambient pressures in the cowling can change a lot, which affect the way that the carburetor itself is operating. And at times we would see that the carburetor would lean when it wasn't supposed to, and it would be rich when it wasn't supposed to. So we went back to again designing the AeroCarb to fulfill this gap. And the neat thing that we could do now is, because we didn't have flow chambers, we can fly upside down. We're not restricted by that. We could get rid of 2 fuel pumps because we don't need that. We can run off of gravity, and we got rid of all of the carburetor heat boxes, etc., that's associated with all of that complication that you have in a normal aircraft engine installation with a float type carburetor. We developed a bunch of conversion parts that this carburetor is set up. It's actually the height of a Marvel Shebler, so this could go on a 65 Continental up to 150 horsepower Lycoming with the proper right size, and that works really well for the kind of flying that we're doing, and that's sport flying and aerobatic flying, etc. It's simple again. I'll explain it again. It's simply a slide. This blue slide is a guillotine. It's pulling out a tapered needle out of a fuel orifice. The fuel goes in and through the orifice as the throttle is opened. The needle is exposed with more. It's got a taper on it, so it allows more fuel to be introduced into the manifold. The mixture control is really a big needle valve that actually shuts the fuel supply down when the carburetor, it's like when you're shutting down a Lycoming or your Cessna 150, you pull the mixture control. That shuts the fuel off. That's what this does. And it allows you to set this intermediately to control the amount of flow to the needle, and then therefore becomes a mixture adjustment. It works really well at altitude, and we don't have to shut off our main fuel tank. As we developed a flight program for the Sonex, we started to do our development on the engine conversion. So what are the things that we had to develop? An intake system, that's one. And I had ideas about ignition systems for a long time. The company Synchro that I talked about that developed the alternator for our engines early on also developed the pointless ignition systems that some of you may be old enough to remember, that lawnmower engines had points and condensers and all kinds of things in them. And at one time you could buy these little conversions, just take all that stuff out and put this little solid state module into it, and actually all the modern lawnmowers and lawn tractors, etc., run with these solid-state ignitions. That was invented by Synchro. So I said, why are we using these archaic magnetos? I knew Jim Slick really well, that owned Slick magnetos and used them a lot. But they're 1929 technology, and why anybody's using them today is just amazing. But we developed the engine, started running it, and we'll talk a little bit about this, and I'm trying not to make this too much of a sales pitch, but about the things that I learned about converting to VWs and what I desire in an engine. And I can honestly say that you know, we operate a fleet of 9 airplanes that we maintain and fly constantly. I probably have flown more different types of VW powered engines than anybody on the planet. And you know, I'll brag about that, yes, because I believe in this engine, and I put my ass behind it all the time. So here it is. This engine is what I call a culmination of all the stuff that we've learned in the past, and they're really important things as far as my concept of what an engine should look like. So here's the features. So this is an important slide. When you're building an airplane, what you want to do is reduce the frontal area of the aircraft. It has to be minimized as much as possible. You notice there's not a lot of stuff sticking out of this engine. We don't have a secondary ignition or a magneto sticking up out of the top of it, so we can have a smooth cowling. The exhaust system is very straightforward. Intake system and etc. is there. These are really important. These are drive lugs that are in the prop hub. When we get it into engines above 1600 cc's, we need enough area, particularly because we're flying propellers that are either wood or wood and composite structures. They have to have enough bearing area to take the loads. If you just used a 5/16 bolt here, it's totally inadequate. So these drive lugs, like in a Continental, like Omega, whatever, are really important for transferring the stress from the prop hub to the prop. One of the things that we've improved over the years is a proprietary stroke crankshaft. It's machined specially for us. Does not, and if you were looking at a regular VW crank here, you would see a gear right here for driving a distributor. We've eliminated that. That's the new bearing surface. These are the 2 main bearings. All of the bearings are stock, so that if AeroVee ever goes away, you can easily find replacement bearings, etc. for this unit. We use a moderately extended prop hub that works for getting the kind of distance we need between the prop and the front of the cowling. We also have a small retaining bolt because it's not that important compared to the large 20mm bolt that's normally in the engine, which gives us more crankshaft strength. And this is the real heart of the engine, and what I think really sets it aside from, with its technology, from anything else that's on the marketplace. And that can be argued, of course, but this is really important to me. One, we've taken the theme of the old X casting. We have there. You can't see them because they're buried back here, but there are 4 shock mounts for the engine. We have these coils here just for display, but what you're looking at is 4 ignition systems, an alternator system, and this is a regulator that's normally mounted on the firewall, a Skytex geared starter, and an accessible alternator that you can just take off or service without taking the engine off the airplane or whatever. It has the Magnetrons, again, a product of Synchro and a Briggs & Stratton product, and I'm going to talk about that in a little bit. But the back of the engine is very clean, very simple, with aero carb or aero injector. This is the heart of it. It's our X. It mounts everything. Starter, alternator, our 2 Magneto units that are self-powered, and eventually our electric system. So this is a Magnetron. This is a simple little deal. You can go down to your local Briggs & Stratton dealer and buy them. This one runs. One of them runs the top 2 forward plugs on the engine. The other one, 180 degrees apart, runs the back 2 upper plugs of the engine. The leads they're correct. This is about a $55 unit compared to what? $500, $600, $700, $800 Magneto, and it has no moving parts. It has a little Hall sensor system that charges it. And the way this works is that we have a 3-pole magnet that's flying by one of the magnetrons. The first 2 poles energize it, and the last one triggers the, as it goes by, it triggers the Hall sensor and fires 2 plugs. So this is firing half of VW. This, by the way, this is again a smaller flywheel than standard. It's our own flywheel. It's a counterweight, and this is the stator magnet ring. This is the part of the alternator. So we have that system which runs by itself. Magnetrons so don't require any electrical input. But the one drawback to them is that they're designed for low compression engines, starting, with 5 to 1 compression ratio or something. So they don't have a real hot spark at low RPM. Well, we solved that with our electronic ignition. We developed our own electronic ignition triggers that fire our dual coils through our plug system, and that is excited by just one little magnet that goes by our modules and fires the system. Again, one of these coils fires 2 of the forward lower cylinders, and one fires the 2 cylinders on the rear of the engine, the lower plugs. We bore our heads for the extra spark plugs. And you'll notice that these are long reach spark plugs, so those are important to realize that the strength of the head we use are racing heads. They're not standard VW heads that use short reach plugs. They're a little heavier, but far worth it with the power that we're putting out. Here's the back of the system. Our magnetron system, the 2 magnetos are fixed. So we're able to sync our electronic ignition to those by simply loosening this screw and turning our timing magnet to where it needs to be and tightening. It's a real simple system to time. We don't notice any mag drop when we switch from one set of ignition systems to the other. The great thing about this is that there's 4 ignition modules, all of which can fire a half of VW. The half of VW will fly the airplane at gross weight. It won't lose altitude. And there are conditions where you'll probably lose altitude, but you can maintain a reasonable amount of descent. The only moving part in all of the ignition system is the crankshaft assembly. Now, if the crankshaft breaks, you're screwed. But you are no matter what kind of ignition system you have on. So this is a real important innovation, I believe, with our engines. Our stator alternators have developed. We have a potted stator. This keeps it from any vibration problems and isolated and makes a really nice system. And this is a 20 amp alternator. So with all the modern electronics we have today, this is plenty of power. If you need more than this, I don't know what you're doing, going around the world or something. But we continued looking at our devices, and this is the Aero Injector. We only call it an Aero Injector instead of Aero Carb because we needed another name for it, simply. It functions exactly the same. It's just reduced in size. It went on a diet. It's about 9 ounces lighter, and it uses a pull throttle system, which is really the best system to use for a carburetor like this because that slide is under a lot of vacuum, and to try and push it open is sometimes harder than pulling it. It'll actually close on its own, so we don't even need a return spring. So you can see the carburetor is pretty small, 6.25 inches by 3 1/8 inches. So it's pretty tiny. So we introduced the engine. I've always built engines of my own, and I just thought when we started developing our conversion that the way we're going to introduce this thing is we're going to provide the best possible components. We're responsible for everything that goes into that engine in the component standpoint, and we're going to let guys assemble that engine. Well, here it is. If you can build an aircraft, you can build an engine. And you'll be smarter for it. I believe that 100%. And a lot of people go, oh, well, I want to buy a ready-to-run engine. Well, I bought a ready-to-run engine a long time ago, and it wasn't ready to run. and I didn't know what to do about it, except I got my hands dirty, and I knew enough from building my own engine prior to that it was important. So it is my mission to provide an engine kit that is as complete as possible with the highest tech, highest quality components to convert it to an aircraft style engine, and that's what all these red parts are. And again, they are at par with anything on the market. And I challenge anybody to go look at competition engines. All you have to do is look. You don't have to buy. You just have to look and see at the way that those engines are carried out. We support this because of our manuals, the way we do things, just like we do with our Sonex aircraft. There's a complete, not only a video that shows you, and it's a little dated, but it gets across the idea of what it takes to convert this engine step by step. But we're really proud of our assembly manual. It goes step by step as far as how to put the engine together. Every page is a task. It shows you the tools you need, the lubricants, the sealants, the torque values, the tools that you need to complete each individual task. And this video that we did was put together in one weekend, and that was with multiple takes, etc., putting an engine together. So we know it can be done by anybody with reasonable skills that has a torque wrench and can follow instructions. You'll have a very successful outcome with it, and that's really, really important in the heart of our business. I don't go with the idea that, you have to have a ready-to-run engine. If you want that, go and get a Continental or a Jabiru, and just go on a Jabiru list and look. It's a fine engine, but look at all of the tech that has to be happening with guys that don't know what's inside the engine and are afraid to attack it. We also look at your success after you've built the engine. How do you make it work right? And I know we have a lot of people out there that are, guys that just don't believe the factory knows what the hell they're doing. Again, we maintain 9 airplanes. We fly them all the time with our conversion parts. We're constantly upgrading them. We've done that. We have developed this engine installation guide that really shows you how to have success in putting the engine together firewall forward. So we all do that for a reasonable competitive price, and we've developed in a line. These are again a lot of my designs, so I'm responsible for it. That's my job in the R&D department, is to come up with stuff that works, including baffle kits. And there's baffles are they're a nightmare if you're building an airplane, and they have a start that does it, whether it's a Sonex or anything else, a Soneray or whatever you're putting an engine on. It's really good to have a system that's proven. Oil separator is really important in aerobatics. We have a breather on the engine. If we fly the airplane upside down, do rolls, etc., we'll dump oil overboard. This is a recovery system just like any aerobatic airplane has, so it's important. And certainly we enjoy flying, and smoke system is hilarious, and we have a good time with it. So what happens? We develop the airplanes like the Sonex. This is our sport trainer that we have several of these that if you came to our program, you'd be able to fly and get an idea what it's like. The various lines, all of our airplanes, the 1X and YX and Xenos, etc., are all AeroVee powered. We have only one airplane in our fleet that has a Jabiru 6-cylinder on it. So the latest developments, what's in our brains now? Between Jeremy and myself and our staff, we're working hard on always improving the AeroVee engine and the contribution VWs make to the aviation industry. So one of those is this, and proof of concept. A lot of people have been following this, obviously waiting for us to come out with it. This is an early proof of concept that was a low-mounted turbo that could fit in a Sonex. You can see it here that the turbo is mounted low. This is one of the early test runs. I always serve a useful place in our development process, so That was it, and we were flying this airplane. We had a little bit of a setback in that one of the test propellers that we were flying was adjustable, and we lost a blade, which caused a considerable amount of damage. Luckily, our aero carb was shuck loose, and the engine shut down, and the airplane was landed safely on a road. It's only 22-foot span, so that's not a big deal, and the airplane was back in our shop within an hour. So that in fact led us to looking at some other things. But here's some stuff. This is a Sensenec prop. It's pretty heavily pitched. Running it on a normal AeroVee and then running it on a turbo, you can see there's a considerable amount of difference in the horsepower output and what we're developing. Recently, last year, we installed an engine test cell. We record all of our runs. This is a turbo running in the test cell, and we've been a little bit hampered with this horrible winter. We couldn't even get our exhaust door open for weeks on end. So that has slowed us down a little bit, but we've got tremendous data on all our stuff, and I'm happy to report that this engine is just awesome. So one of the challenges was this. We saw that early configuration with the turbo-mounted lows being scavenged. The challenge in what takes so much time, it seems like it takes forever, but with all the other projects that we have going, this is just one of the things that go along. And here we're looking at the turbo that's in the sweet spot, and by that I mean this turbo is mounted in a position now where it fits literally all of our mounts on the Sonex aircraft. This is a 1X mount. It would fit a Sonex tri-gear, standard gear, Zenith, Xenos. It's a long day today, but the Xenos and those are all fit, including the nose wheel of the airplane. So this is a 1X that has the provision for a nose wheel, so we had to avoid that. The only thing that's going to change, and this is just a short stack for setting up in our test cell. The only thing that's going to change is this stack will be routed down to the center, and it will be a different configuration for the different mounts. This will be the kind of turn it makes for a 1X mount, but it has a little bit different routing for a Sonex mount. So that's the only thing that changes on the system. It uses a Scavenge Pump. It's a dual pump that we have that pulls the oil, the scavenge oil, from the turbo, so we don't have to drain it by gravity. So we can mount the turbo a little bit lower and get it in the position, and it simply works really well. It has an automatic wastegate. So we've just been going forward with this, and this is great. So I'm going to kind of finish up this rapid pace, but where can you experience flying these airplanes? If you've never flown a VW, come to Sonex. We have a T-Flight program where we can do transition training before you fly your Sonex or related airplanes. Get stick time and ground school, etc. It's a real neat program. Joe Norris, ex-CEA, a lot of you guys know, great instructor, and has been doing a good job, a very enthusiastic job, and we've been pushing a lot of people through our program. Now that spring is coming, it'll be more and more active. So by all means, if you want to really know what an AeroVee performs like, this is the real good way to get it done. So that's it, and thank you for tuning in. I hope I haven't bored you, but there's a lot of stuff going on. We continue to work on improving the project. I love this engine. Obviously, I've got hundreds and hundreds of hours behind them, and again, that is where I have all my confidence in this robust, almost perfect engine for converting from auto to aircraft.
Awesome. Thank you so much, John. Wow, that was amazing. That was like a mind dump of your VW experience in an hour. That was awesome. We did get a lot of good questions that have come in, so let me jump right into them there.
Okay.
Bill asks, what have been your secrets to getting good cooling on your engines?
What is the secret for getting cooling on the engine? Is really simple. Doing what we say. And this picture that's in front of you, you can see the cooling baffles on it. Sealing that, making sure that there's a lot of things. Proper carburetor tuning, running the engine. When we run engines in, we simply run the heck out of them to start with. A lot of guys spend a lot of time taxiing around. Babying the engine. That's the worst thing you can do for it, because what we want to do is we want to seat the rings. So even the same thing would happen with when I built 14 Cubs, and we do the same thing with Continentals, etc. First flight, we run it at full throttle for as long as we can, and we watch it. We can watch the oil temperatures go down and cylinder head temperatures go down as soon as the rings seat. That's really important. The worst thing to do is to be taxiing around thinking you're babying your engine, and that's not good. So proper breaking in of the engine, proper baffling. We have, again, that firewall forward, and there are always guys that we see them on the lists all the time that have minimal experience but think they're an expert, and they're going to the factory doesn't know anything. And believe me, I'm not allowed to get on the internet. I'm just not allowed, because I'd probably be lighting people up too much, and that's not good. So I prefer to present it in this manner,
I think, John, you might have unplugged your microphone there, perhaps, or maybe hit your mute button. Just stand by, folks.
Yeah, I did hit my mute button, so it fell on my knee. All right, so.
Gotcha.
Did you hear that last part anyway, or not?
You were just, I think, wrapping up with, it's important to follow the factory recommendations.
Exactly.
For your installation of baffling to get best cooling, because you've tested it and you found that works best for the installation. So.
Yep.
Okay, so moving on here, Don is wondering, does the AeroVee lend itself to the later possibility of a constant speed prop?
Not really. We don't have any oil passages through. It depends on what kind of constant speed prop you'd have. But keep in mind that this, my whole deal through my career has been to produce airplanes that are inexpensive to operate and build as much as possible. The philosophy has always been, if we build an airplane or produce an airplane kit that you can build for the average price of an automobile, that's our sweet spot. Now, constant speed props, there aren't very many that are available that are good enough to warrant putting on an airplane, and I'm not a real big fan of it, so we haven't spent a lot of time getting in that direction. We do have a wonderful Sonex composite ground adjustable propeller now, which is really cool because again, I probably didn't mention, but if the turbo does come out, it'll be retrofittable to any AeroVee engine that's out there. And by having a prop like that, you only have one purchase, and it's adjustable to be able to take not only the standard AeroVee but up to the turbo. So that's an important thing.
Okay, great. Don's wondering, is there any advantage to a 3 versus 2 blade prop for the AeroVee in a 1X?
Yeah. No. The worst thing you could do is put more blades on a propeller. The only reason multiple propellers blades exist is to absorb a lot of horsepower with a small diameter because of gear clearance. The best prop you could ever have is one blade. So anything beyond that, believe me, I've flown on our Sonnery 1. We flew over 100 different propellers. Some of those were 3-bladed, and with very, very poor results. So I would never recommend putting a 3-bladed prop on unless you're looking for some dandy look that really doesn't do you any good.
Okay, Robert's wondering, what happened to the Nicosil cylinder option for the AeroVee engine?
Really simple. The manufacturer stopped making them, so we can't get them anymore. That's the simple fact. It was a nice option. One of the deals, though, is that going to the turbo, you're going to want cast iron cylinders anyway.
And Brian's wondering, the only exhaust offered right now appear to be the 2-to-1 configuration. Why isn't the straight exhaust option offered anymore?
There just wasn't any demand for it, so that was discontinued. The 2-to-1 works better for scavenging the engine anyway. So I don't know why you'd want the long exhaust unless you could just build something like a Sonneray where you have 6-inch exhaust stacks. Those work pretty well.
And Greg's wondering if you could comment briefly on crankshaft breakage.
Crankshaft breakage. Well, every airplane that I've ever seen has, or any engine I've ever seen has crankshaft breakage. We've eliminated that issue by the way we do our crankshafts now, and that isn't an issue related to the AeroVee. It's related to any conversion that might have 2180 based engine or a 1600cc based engine or whatever. It has to do with a lot with what the prop is, what the installation was like, etc. So yeah, there's crankshafts that break, but we live next to Myers Aviation. That's a auto body shop for airplanes, and we see Lycomings and Continentals with broken crankshafts all the time. It's not a pleasant thing, but it's a fact of life.
And Jim asks, why have you not developed a gear reduction unit for your AeroVees to permit turning a larger diameter prop for the slower flying crowd?
It's simple. We like to go fast. With the airplanes that we have, it's horses for courses, and our niche market is building engines. We pride ourselves on the fact that we are one of the few aircraft manufacturers that also build engines. And these engines are suited for our designs perfectly. All of our airplanes are designed around this horsepower, 80 horsepower. And the reduction drives, it's just more machinery. I am, as you saw with the simplicity of the ignition system and the systems that we have on the AeroVee, you know that what I believe is that you take parts off of airplanes, you don't put more on.
Gotcha.
Oh, by the way, let me comment about that also. The largest airplane we have in our fleet is the Xenos. It spans 44 feet. It has the smallest propeller of all of our airplanes, and it outclimbs them all. So there.
Yeah, well, one thing I love about your planes is the efficiency. All those miles per gallon. That's something I really love about your designs.
There's always ways to build slicker airplanes, and that's a matter of craftsmanship and a lot of little tuning and everything. But our planes out of the box are pretty simple. They're designed to have moderately good performance and do the job at a reasonable, affordable price. So that's all it's about with us. And all these airplanes are designed because either myself or Jeremy or Pete Buck, who helps, is an important part of our design group. We design these airplanes for ourselves, and that selfish thing is that. If it's what we really love, other people will start to do it, and that's the way Sonneray started. I built that racer for myself, and other people wanted it, and that spawned a business making canopies and cowlings and components, etc. As far back as 1971. So, that's the important thing to us, and we want to keep improving them, but we also want an airplane that has utility, and you could tie it down outside or fold it up and put it in your garage when you need to.
Cool. Vic's wondering, is the crank prop hub connection tapered?
No, our prop hub is the front of our crankshaft's bigger than standard VW's sizes, and it's a shrink fit hub. It can be removed and replaced or refitted with bearing changes. So we think this is really the simplest way to go. And we see some other engines. I always call them white wives' tales because I've been around here for so long that The bearings aren't big enough in the front of the engine. Well, there's two main bearings that are in very close proximity to each other on the front of the crank, and they'll take any of the radial loads that we impose on the engine. The thrust loads are taken through the crankshaft, which is robust. You can hang everything on it. The thrust loads on these propellers is far less than what we put on an engine with a clutch and a clutch pedal.
Gotcha. Brad's wondering, is there a heat muff available for the exhaust?
We don't really do that. We're pretty robust people here in Oshkosh. There are a lot of guys that will put a heat muff on it. We don't have a standard heater in our airplanes. Our airplanes Sonex has big bubble canopy, and the issue is more cooling than heating. But there's some real neat answers for cabin heat, and one of them is electric heated seats.
Cool. Brian asks, you keep referring to your ignition system as having magnetos. Can the AeroVee be hand propped to life?
Yes, it can. It can be hand propped with the electric ignition. And that's the beauty of, and I guess maybe I didn't explain that carefully enough, is that the electric ignition, the 12-volt system, will fire at about 5 volts. So even if your battery's way down, you can prop it. Now, I wouldn't recommend that to anybody who has never propped an airplane. As you know, Tim, that's not the best proposition if you are not skilled at that issue. So, the best thing to do is wait and go get a jump. So, and I mean battery jump. So, anyways, that's the deal.
Okay, great. Don's wondering, what adjustments to operate auto fuel?
Adjustments to operate auto fuel. We normally run our engines about 8-to-1 compression ratio. Sometimes you can run them a little higher than that if you're using 100 low lead, like 9-to-1. That works pretty well. We don't say that in our manual, but that's what we run some of our engines at. I am just not a fan of auto fuel. We burn 4 gallons an hour. As long as 100 low lead is available. If you can't afford the 4 gallons an hour of aviation fuel, you're in the wrong business. Auto fuel is so inconsistent, and unless you have really good quality 92 octane, etc., it doesn't have ethanol in it, that's fine. And you can reduce the compression ratio down to 7-to-1, but you lose horsepower. So that's the big issue, and I am not a fan of auto fuel at all.
Okay. Brad, just wondering, what's the expected TBO of the engine?
As you know, Brad, there's no TBO on experimental aircraft engines. It's not a Lycoming or Continental certified engine. That's a certified kind of question. What we do is we look at compression ratio probably and oil burning. 1,000 hours out of an engine. The great thing about all VW conversions, and not only ours, is that the basic core of the engine is all pretty much the same, whether it's a XYZ engine or if it's an AeroVee. The cylinders, pistons, you can go out and buy a set of new cylinders, pistons, piston rings, and piston pins, for less than $300. So, the overhauls on these engines are very, very moderate, and it's just a matter of they like to run, the average, as you know, Tim, the average home builder, really, and the reality check is on the side of our airplanes. That logo is the reality check is that you have 52 weeks a year. There's only 52 weekends. The most average people can get out about half of those weekends if they're lucky. They don't have holidays. They don't have birthdays. They don't have family deals, etc. They don't have bad weather. They can go out and fly. So if they put on realistically 30 or 40 hours a year, that's a lot. And if you're getting 1,000 hours out of an engine, that's a lot of flying. The engine's going to rust out before it wears out.
Yeah, for sure. Tom wonders, he's got a specific question here. Our idle is rough at 500 to 600 RPM. It smooths out at 800 and above. Can we smooth the idle
no.
at the idle screw on the AeroCarb?
No, you don't want it to idle at 500 RPM. You want it to idle at about 8 to 900 RPM. And that's just the way it is. It's an aircraft engine now. Aircraft conversion. It's not your automobile, so there's nothing wrong with letting it idle smoothly and not loading up at 500 RPM. So trying to make it idle at 500 RPMs is folly.
Okay, and Don's wondering about inverted oil and fuel for sustained inverted flight.
An AeroVee or any VW is just like any continental or Lycoming. If you're gonna want extended inverted flight, you're gonna have to do an oil changeover system, which means that you're gonna have to provide a system in which the pump is be able to pull oil from the top of the engine when it's inverted and recirculate it. But for normal aerobatics, like we do, up to sportsman intermediate aerobatics, just the standard system is fine. And with an oil, I showed you that oil separator. That's something that returns the oil and allows the engine to breathe when it's inverted, and then returns the oil to the engine back. I really, a lot of guys have these oil separators that are collectors. And that oil that's in that oil separator is doing you no damn good, except to sit there and take up space in an oil collector. It's got to be returned to the engine. Oh, well, it's all frothed up. Well, you ought to see the oil that comes out of a turbo. It's the same thing. It's like going through an osterizer. It is also frothy, and we have to be able to bring it back to its liquid state. And the way you do that is by cooling it and throwing it back in the engine and recovering the oil. So those are important things to remember. And most people don't even. Guys don't even think about that. They just think about, I don't want to return this dirty oil to my engine. Well, it came out of your engine, and with proper oil changes and maintenance, it's not an issue.
Gotcha. And Don wonders, is there a required break-in period oil versus a standard use oil?
No, we just use actually automotive racing oil, 2050 weight, Valvoline or equivalent in our engines instead of aircraft oil. They're basically auto engines and been running years and years on that. So, a side note to that is that I had my first 2180 VW engine was in a car called a Puma in 1977, and I had that up until 2000 with an engine that produced over 150 horsepower with dual Webers, and just ran the heck out of that engine, and it just used standard oil. So that's a valuable experience.
Cool. Well, we're getting close to the end here. Let's keep going with some more questions here. There's been a lot of comments thanking you for such a great presentation. One fellow said that he's going to have to look up Betty at convention here this year and shake her hand.
Well, she's been we've been privileged. She's sitting right next to me as we speak, and she's been next to me ever since we got married. As far as doing this enterprise of building airplanes and going racing and moving and having kids and the whole deal. So, like Audrey Pulver, she's a huge support to everything that we do, and that's the most valuable thing you can have is to have a partner that says, do it.
That's awesome, and you have been blessed in that way.
Mm-hmm.
Brian asks, you've mentioned trying a number of tails on your planes, and in the picture of the Sonerai 2 you show both a squared off tail and a more classic rounded tail surfaces. Which do you like best and why?
Well, that's pretty observant, and the squared off tail is really interesting because back in the day we made a complete fiberglass mold shell for the Sonerai. That was a shell that covered the whole thing instead of fabric, and it was easiest to do the squared off tail, and there was no real other reason to that. The rounded tail was to look like a Spitfire. Spitfire is probably the coolest airplane ever built. And there was just a little homage to it in our racers because, I couldn't afford a Spitfire, but I could afford to dream and make noise and make machine gun sounds and things like that when I was chasing people down. So that's, that's the deal. It's the same question comes about with our V-tails or what we call are Y tails, and even in the picture that's up on the screen right now, you can see the jet's tail has a little sub rudder, and it's a Y tail because it has a rudder plus rudder vaders. And we found that, like even on the YX or anything, you have to have a rear view mirror to know which tail you have on the airplane.
Gotcha. Walt says, have you tore down any engines you made after many hours of use? Were there any abnormal wear issues compared to standard aircraft engines?
The answer to that, we are tearing engines down all the time because our fleet is experimental. It's for R&D purposes, and that's why we had, when we went into our T-Flight program, which are now, these engines are being run at they're really worst environment, run all the time like in a flight school. Of course we've torn down the engines, and sometimes we have found unusual things, things that have gotten into the engine that we wouldn't have expected, etc. But all in all, it's pretty similar to anything you'd find. It's just like aircraft. It's just a lot of things. The way you solve all that, of course, is you get a jet.
And that's a time for another webinar, isn't it?
That's right.
Talking about your whole jet program.
That's right.
I know you got new and exciting things going on with that right now too.
You bet. But the AeroVee and the engine development is the core of our business. And when better things come along, we're constantly working on things. We're working on other features that we think are desirable, and when they're ready to be marketed, they are. But right now, this is the finest and state of the art as far as aero conversions go for VW airplanes engines, and we're very proud of that. And like I said, all you have to do is go around and look at the different engines and look at their features. They're all basically the same core engine, so what you're really buying is the way that the engine is converted.
Gotcha. And let's just get in a couple of quick questions here as we reach the end here. Is the smoke system still available?
It actually isn't, but it's pretty simple to do. We just ran out of energy on that. There wasn't that much demand for it, and a lot of guys were building it. It's simply a nice little tank. Ours is about a gallon tank. It's a facet fuel pump with an electric solenoid that shuts it on and off. It turns the pump on at the same time, and it feeds fuel through an orifice into the exhaust system. So it's pretty simple to do.
Cool. And Gary wonders if demo flights will be available during AirVenture.
Never. We just don't do it. We don't have the staff or the energy to do it, unfortunately, but you're certainly welcome to stop prior to AirVenture or after, when you can have a quality experience with our T-Flight program.
Cool. And Peter's just wondering, any progress on the electric-powered motor option?
Yeah, the electric airplane is very much in the forefront. It's taken a little bit of a backseat to the jet program, which is very, very exciting, and it looks to be successful. And that's where our energy is. The electric airplane is totally financed out of our pockets as far as the technology has gone into it. We've invested a tremendous amount of time, energy, and, as they say, treasure in that development, and it's by far not dead. We're very proud of that system because we own all of the technology in it, from the battery management system to the motors to the controllers, the whole system. So in the future, when it's ready, meaning when we're all ready for electric power, we'll be at the forefront with that.
Cool. Wayne's wondering, any issues with valve problems like Continental and like Homing's have, or any specific things with valves related
well,
to
AeroVee? Valves are just something that you do. Once the initial engine runs in, a valve seat, we hardly ever have to touch them. But when we do an oil change, we'll adjust the valves. They're mechanical adjusters. Very simple thing to do. They're very accessible. So, that's just a matter of fact, and just to double check them. And that's something you want to keep in mind on. If you for some reason found that the valve stems are stretching or anything, it's probably an overheat situation. So you haven't been paying attention to your cylinder head temps or your mixtures or whatever.
Okay, and let's get to the last question here before we wrap it up. Don says, it seems like the aircraft and engine perform very well without a turbo. What increases do you expect from the turbo installation versus not? Performance at altitude or what?
Yeah, both. It's really, we'll have more than 100 horsepower at takeoff demonstrated already. And the neat thing is that we're kind of in the realm of being able to use a fixed pitch propeller or adjustable propeller that's ground adjustable to not only get a boost on takeoff but maintain horsepower at altitude. In our head-on-head flights with the 3300, we find as we go higher, we're passing or at least maintaining with the 3300. So, I mean, that's a 120 horsepower engine, but it's losing a lot of horsepower at altitude, and we're maintaining it. And the neat thing about it is that at altitude, if you're running 80 horsepower, running full throttle, well, it's no worse than the normal engine is at sea level. So we're not developing a lot of heat problems with it. Everybody's going, oh, well, you're going to have a lot of heat problems. Well, the normal operating engines, you use full power on takeoff, and as soon as you reach a reasonable climb rate, you're throttling back a bit, and as you climb to altitude, of course, the turbos start maintaining some of that power. So it's a really nice solution. As we found in cars, all the time in cars now, there's turbos. It's much more readily available, and that's our objective.
Awesome. Well, just a lot of comments thanking you for taking the time tonight, John, and sharing your experiences.
Well, thanks everybody for listening. I'm known as kind of a curmudgeon when it comes to, and I hope I haven't offended anybody, but we're pretty set in the philosophy of what we're doing and what we have done, and it's all based on experience.
That's great. And Alan made a comment here. He said he loves your candor.
Well, good, Alan. I appreciate that too. So
awesome.
There's no better way than to be that way. Thank you.
Very good, sir. Well, thank you so much for joining us tonight, John. Good luck. Keep it safe over there at Sonex, and thank you so much for your work in developing all these cool things for us experimental people to build and fly. So thank you so much for being with us
tonight. I appreciate it, and come and see us at Sonic Fun. We'll be doing some forums there, and of course, we're always here at the Fly-In, and we have open houses every day, so you can come through our facility and look at our stuff, and everybody is welcome. Thank you for listening to me.
That's great. Thank you so much for all the attendees for tuning in tonight. Next week we'll be talking about Chapter Chat, and Brian Olina, the Young Eagles program manager, will be talking about Beyond the Young Eagles flight. Thank you all so much for tuning in tonight. Have a great night, everybody.